Welcome to the Andy Staples Show, Realignment Palooza. Stuff's happening, but not really happening yet. No bombshells yet. If this were NBA Twitter, we wouldn't have any Woj bombs yet, since UCLA and USC to the Big Ten. But Matt Fortuna from The Athletic joins me. And Matt, I think that day's coming, and it's coming maybe sooner rather than later.
Yeah, that's a funny segue you make because I think of it as like Kevin Durant requests a trade, but how does he get out of the Nets deal when he's got 3 years left on it? That sounds a little bit like some of the TV contracts that a lot of these schools are dealing with their current conferences right now. In some ways, I'm surprised there hasn't been any other movement in the 5 days since that initial news broke of USC and UCLA going to the Big Ten, because that happened awfully quickly, part of that, holiday weekend. But I wouldn't be surprised if 3 days from now we're looking at a completely different college landscape. I also wouldn't be surprised if a week from now we're still having this exact same discussion of, okay, what's going to be the next shoe to drop? Because we all thought this would happen last year in the immediate aftermath of Texas, Oklahoma leaving the Big 12 for the SEC. And one thing that did happen that not mattering in the big picture, but mattered in the short term, was the alliance, which I think its whole purpose was to get us to stop talking and speculating about it. And that
Didn't work.
it served its purpose for a couple of months, but not even a full year. And so here we are, back to the drawing board, back to square one. The gravitational forces, if you will, are clearly aligning for there to be a Big Two, and it's a matter of how do we get from here to there, and what kind of steps happen between now and then.
Well, let's talk about what happened Tuesday. Everybody was nice enough to take the holiday off and maybe work a little behind the scenes, but some things happened on Tuesday, tangible things that we know that have been confirmed. The Pac-12, their president said, George Kliavkoff, begin negotiating our next media rights deal right now. And this is one that expires in 2024. And it would be a year ahead of when the Big 12 would do its next one. And it's also the reason that USC and UCLA are leaving in 2024. So there's that they can get some tangible numbers about what that group of 10 schools looks like, or potentially what that group of 10 schools plus maybe some other schools would look like. But I don't think that means anything in terms of a deal. It's not like they're gonna hammer out a deal here in this next week and throw up the flag and say we're gonna stay together. Because if you're Oregon, if you're Washington, you're not signing squat until you know definitively that you're not going to the Big Ten.
Yeah, I think more than anything else, that was a public kind of punch, if you will, saying, hey, we're going to be aggressive too. We're not just going to sit here waiting to get picked apart by whoever wants our remaining schools. We need to do something. And look, there are a lot of reports out there, and I'm sure there's plausible deniability with all this. There's a lot of different language that gets used with these situations. But clearly the Big 12 is looking to annex part of the Pac-12.
Oh, yeah.
What does that mean? I mean, because in my opinion, the Pac-12 schools that might go to the Big 12 might be better off staying in the Pac-12 if Oregon and Washington stay the Pac-12. Now, I don't expect some form of commitment to come from either of those two schools, but clearly those are the two schools that control the fate of the Pac-12 as of right now.
Yes.
And in some ways, I think it would be premature for some of those Pac-12 schools to head off to purportedly greener pastures of the Big 12. But I understand it's kind of a kill or be kill game right now, and you can't just sit around waiting for someone else to do something. So it's going to be interesting. I still, it's hard for me to imagine the Pac-12 falling apart as we know it if those two schools ultimately commit.
Yes.
But that remains to be seen.
I would agree with that. Now, Dennis Dodd, our friend from CBS, reported that the Big 12 was into, I think he used the phrase deep discussions. I don't know exactly what that means. It's a fairly subjective term, but with 6 Pac-12 schools about joining the Big 12, which I wrote back long before Texas and Oklahoma left that the Big 12's best move was to try to raid the best of the Pac-12. Now, that was when they still had USC and UCLA, also Oregon and Washington. They didn't do that. Texas and Oklahoma left. I remember this time, not this time last year, but right after Texas and Oklahoma left, remember the American was kind of saber rattling about, we're going to go try to get the Big 12
Right.
schools that are left. Well, no, they didn't, because the Big 12 schools that were left realized, oh, wait, no, we can just take the best of them, which if Oregon and Washington stay in the Pac-12, conceivably that's what could happen to the Big 12. But if they don't, it's a different ball game. And if you're the Arizona schools, if you're Utah, now Colorado said that they were committed to the Pac-12 in a statement from their chancellor today. But you can say that now, but if the situation changes, you can just say the situation changed.
I mean, you wrote that, if I'm not mistaken, right after Mike Bone, shortly after getting to USC, was essentially non-committal to the future of the Pac-12,
Correct.
if I recall correctly. It is a little ironic that, and I get why it's happening now because of the TV contracts, but it is a little ironic that it took Larry Scott leaving, like that they didn't leave while Larry Scott was still in charge. Not that the elimination
I think
of
they
Larry
needed the
Scott
Big Ten to say yes.
They needed the Big Ten to say yes, and I'm not sure the Big Ten had the appetite to expand before the SEC did, nor did Kevin Warren was probably in his transitional phase at that point.
He might not even started. I can't remember.
He got hired, officially announced in May of 2019, but Delaney stayed on the rest of the calendar year. So timing's everything in that regard. But, talk about a happy new year, happy anniversary, George Kliavkoff, president. I mean, literally on the 365th day of his tenure, he gets dealt with that. That same week, in fact, that same day, us on The Athletic had written a story on Brett Yormark, the new Big 12 commissioner, and that was, a pretty big bombshell in the world of college sports last week before the realignment news. And it sounds ironic in retrospect, and we're talking about 5 whole days ago, but a lot of it was, hey, the Big 12 got their George Kliavkoff. That took on an entirely different meaning.
Well,
24 hours later.
We don't know if either one of these guys knows what they're doing in this
Right.
situation. Now, I will say that Brett Yormark going to the Big 12 will join a bunch of people who have, at this point, if you've been in the Big 12 for a while, if you've been at your school for a while, you've been through
seen everything.
Every conceivable realignment scenario that you can imagine. You've been the conference about to implode, the conference about to explode, the conference taking other members, the conference auditioning other members, you name it. They've seen it all. Meanwhile, everybody in the Pac-12, up until Thursday of last week, most of them thought none of this would ever happen to them.
Yeah, and it makes for an interesting kind of standoff right now, right? Because I think you're wondering who's going to shoot who first, who's going to grab the other best products first. And on one end, you've got the Pac-12 that was blindsided by this and doesn't really know how to react and recover for this because they haven't lost schools. Remember, they added schools from the Big 12 back in 2010 and from the Mountain West in Utah's case. And you've got the Big 12, which, to your point, no matter who the commissioner's been there, no matter what the state of college sports has been, it's been a revolving door of, at the very least, speculation, if not outright, defection to other conferences. And you throw in the fact that they're now doing this under a new commissioner who, by all accounts, I don't mean this in a good or bad way, but could not be any more different from Bob Bowlesby, the guy he's replacing. I think, look, when Oklahoma and Texas left the Big 12 last year, there were a lot of hurt personal feelings on both sides. Like, how could they do this to some of those in-state programs? How could they sever these relationships with the people in this conference? Whereas now, I think in a weird way, Brett Yormark's walking in at the perfect time, because a week ago, everyone in the Big 12 was Googling this guy. They were sending out texts to reporters saying, who is this guy? Do you know anything about him? And quite frankly, in the college athletic space, he doesn't have any experience whatsoever. That might be a good thing now, because he's looking at this purely strategically, purely bottom line. Hey, there's a big void out there to be the number 3 conference in this land of 2. And what is holding us back from punching forward and becoming that number 3 conference? That is our throne to claim, and we're going to go and take it regardless of whose feelings get hurt in the process.
Well, and if you think about it, now, if what Dennis reported came to fruition, let's say they could get the best 6 of the Pac-12, or not the best 6, but the 6 that make the most sense, which would be Oregon, Washington,
Arizona,
Colorado,
Arizona State.
Utah, Arizona, Arizona State. That league, with the 12 that the Big 12 already has, probably makes more money per school than the ACC right now.
I would think so. I mean, you look at the breadth of media markets, and I know what the Boston media markets want. They're big media markets in the traditional sense in the ACC. But in the college football sense, I think the media markets would probably garner a larger valuation in
Right.
that version of
And
the
these,
Pac-12 and Big 12.
and most of these are schools where they actually like football a lot. And I think that's one thing when the ACC took from the Big East. Some of those schools, like Virginia Tech, they love football. It's a huge football school. But then some of them are, Syracuse, Boston College. They like football there, but it's not the same thing. It's not that fan base is not as passionate as, say, Oregon or Washington or Utah. And so I am fascinated by this, but here's the thing. I think they're all in a holding pattern, as you said, until Oregon and Washington know what they want to do. And Oregon and Washington are in a holding pattern because everybody is waiting on a certain group of people who wear gold helmets, who reside in South Bend, Indiana, a program that used to cover On the Beat and now still talk about on a podcast called The Shamrock. Everybody's waiting on Notre Dame, Matt, and I don't know. To me, after last Thursday, my whole Notre Dame never needs to join a conference stance ended. I don't know that you can be independent in a world where there's 2 mega conferences.
Yeah, before I got to The Athletic, I co-hosted a podcast with Mike Monaco, Notre Dame graduate who just called the College World Series, called Still Independent. That podcast no longer exists. Notre Dame's independence still does exist, at least as we record this. I am with you. You, as I'm just like I have been asked this question a million times in a million different forums with every single change that comes to college athletics. Oh, will this make Notre Dame join a conference? And my answer the previous 100 times was always no. And you think back to even less than a full year ago when this Big 12 SEC news broke. That was on the heels of the college football playoff publicly saying we intend to go to 12.
Right.
And Jack Swarbrick, the Notre Dame athletic director, was one of the 4 people who helped devise that system that included a seat at the table for Notre Dame. And I remember thinking, again, this is 11 months ago, boy, this is where you see the value of independence. You've got 64 Power 5 programs on pins and needles right now, wondering what's going to happen to their league, who they're going to be playing, what the future holds. And Notre Dame, they're playing a hand while they're counting cards. Like they're gaming the playoff system while creating the playoff system. And as we've seen with at least in the later years of Brian Kelly era, we'll see with the future of Marcus Freeman. 12-team playoff, Notre Dame's getting in darn near every year. With
that system that they drew up, Notre Dame would have never had to join a conference. But that's the other piece of this. And Ari and I talked about it a little bit on Monday, but everybody asking us questions about the playoff, just put a pin in those. We don't know what the playoff will be. We don't know if there will even be a playoff when all this is said and done.
I mean, Greg Sankey tried to warn us pretty much every single time he got in front of a microphone. I don't have to do this. I remember I asked him the last question. Him and Bob Bowlesby at the title game, the day of the title game in Indianapolis this year. There were some more playoff meetings. It might have been the last meetings before they actually decided we're not going to do anything before the current contract expires. And Bowlesby and Sankey were both very vocal about their disappointment. And Greg Sankey got up and I said, so what's the next step? And he's in typical Greg Sankey fashion, he stares at me, he smiles, and he goes, the next step for me is I'm going to go across the street to watch a college football playoff championship game between 2 great teams from the SEC. And that was one of those, hey guys, you had your chance. Now we can essentially do whatever we want. And that was true then. It's even more true now, at least if you include the Big Ten in there, because the ACC didn't want this. And the ACC might be the one that pays the biggest price when all is said and done from not agreeing to an expanded playoff.
Exactly right. And this just reminds me, Matt, of, do you remember when during that last big round of realignment, when for a few weeks, Conference USA and the Mountain West were going to expand, we're going to merge. Like there was they had a teleconference, and Craig Thompson, the Mountain West commissioner, and Britton Banowski, the Conference USA commissioner, were on it, and they were talking. And Britton Banowski said something really interesting, because this is like, it's either 2011 or 2012. I can't remember. I think it was 2011, because the playoff format had not been decided yet. That what the play, oh, it had to be 2011. They hadn't even decided there was going to be a playoff yet. And somebody asked him about the BCS, and he said, "You gotta think about it. What if there is no BCS?" And I thought back to the Matrix. You've seen the Matrix? I take it, Matt.
I haven't seen it in the last 10 years, but I did see it. Like I remember the
So,
concept.
do you remember when they go to the Oracle's apartment? It's the lady who bakes the cookies. When Keanu Reeves is waiting to go see her, there's a kid there, and he's bending a spoon with his mind. And Neo goes, "How do you do that?" And the kid goes, "First, you must realize there is no spoon." And that's what that is. Like, you have to realize there is no spoon here. There is no playoff past 2025. And we don't know what the conferences are going to look like to even make a playoff. So a lot of that stuff we have to put out of our minds. And you just mentioned the ACC being the one that was in the way of it. And I would say, in an attempt to lever Notre Dame into the ACC in football, which that feels like it really ain't going to happen now. But what if Notre Dame says, we're going to the Big Ten? Suddenly the ACC's deal is fundamentally different. Even though Notre Dame's only a member of the ACC in its other sports, it does have a contract where it plays 5 ACC teams a year. That is a valuable part of the ACC's TV deal. If I were a member of the ACC and I was not pleased with the ACC, I would say that fundamentally changes the deal.
Yeah, Keanu Reeves was trending today as well, so very timely.
Wow.
I think for his interaction with a boy at an airport, he was talking, answering questions forever. I don't know if there was a spoon involved.
Was the boy bending the spoon?
There is no spoon, Andy. There is no spoon. I completely agree with you. I wasn't so sure that Jim Phillips' leverage play was for Notre Dame so much as it was, hey, ESPN, you clearly want this playoff to expand. You're going to have to do us a solid here, because you've got us in this pretty disadvantageous TV contract that we need to work around. And if you help us with that, we'll help you with your playoff. And as right now, that backfired, clearly backfired. I always thought the idea of Notre Dame in a conference, well, let me back up. I think the idea of Notre Dame in a conference today is not the same as the idea of Notre Dame in a conference last week. And by that, I mean, last Tuesday, if Notre Dame said we're joining the Big Ten, the reaction would have been, okay, are you just going to marginalize yourself as yet another Midwestern football power in a league full of them? And do you lose what makes you unique from a football program? Now, that's not a Midwestern conference anymore. That's a national conference. It's not even a conference. I mean, by definition, it touches pretty much every piece of this country, at least northern piece of this country.
Yeah, it hasn't gone south yet, we'll get to that in a second. Yeah.
Not yet. So I think if you're Notre Dame, you got to look at it and say, hey, we could still play SC every year. We could still get to the East Coast every year. We could keep pretty much all of our rivals. And oh, by the way, we'll be making somewhere in the neighborhood of ballpark 80 million more per year from our media rights deal.
Well, and remember, the Big Ten has not finished negotiating its media rights deal. And I think this is the holdup right now. Is Notre Dame coming or not? And if I'm Fox, which is, one, going to have the biggest piece of it, and two, also advising the Big Ten on what it should do with the rest of it, which, by the way, a lot of conflicts going on there. But I digress here.
Well, we need George Glabkov to go on say to Fox what Bob Bowlesby said to ESPN last year.
Exactly. Yeah, this feels a little more naked than that one. So, but here's the thing: if they say we're going to give you X if Notre Dame comes, the Big Ten can say, listen, let's just do this now. We'll give you most favored nation status because I'm not. We'll find out the details of everything when USC and UCLA actually join or as they get closer to joining. My guess is they're not getting a full share right off the bat because they're still going to be making more even if they don't than they would have made in the Pac-12. Notre Dame can negotiate because Notre Dame can get whatever it wants. It can say, I want a full share. It can say, I'm bringing a lot more share than some of these other places. And oh, by the way, the SEC would also take us.
The SEC would absolutely take them. I mean, that's me saying that. That's not source info, but I think anyone would take them at this point.
Everyone who has a conference that plays football would take Notre Dame. This is not up for debate.
No, it's not. And I think Big Ten probably makes the most sense. I think if you're Notre Dame, they're going to be strategic about it. I'm not sure if there's a lot of commentary out there about, they got to act fast. They don't want to be boxed into a situation. I don't see them ever being on the outside looking in with any of this, right? Like, I just think there's going to be a seat at the table for them at whichever.
Yeah, they could join it at any time, but it would probably be convenient to join sooner rather than later because that gets the maximum amount of TV money. And then if the Big Ten wants to expand more afterward, they could. You just put a clause in the deal that said, okay, pro rata share for any members that we deem worthy to add. And then you're done. You've got that taken care of. The biggest deal they could get per school is one that includes Notre Dame right now. So that's the Big Ten's incentive, but you're right. Notre Dame doesn't necessarily have any incentive to do anything right now, though, the NBC deal is not that far away from ending.
I think 25, 26, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So the 25 football season will be the last one. And from a dollars and cents standpoint, if they get a full share in the Big Ten, they could just buy it out if they wanted to.
They could buy out, or, I mean, who's to say NBC still isn't going to get a piece of this next Big Ten?
Right.
And if that happens, that's going to completely change the dynamics, I think, of Notre Dame's current deal.
You could actually, if you think about it this way, you could keep Notre Dame on NBC as a Big Ten school.
Yeah.
Make that NBC's package.
Well, when I think SBJ earlier this year, maybe February or so, reported that NBC was interested in talking to the Big Ten. My first thought was, oh, crap, what's this mean for Notre Dame? Because that's kind of how a lot of our minds go. And my thinking in real time was, well, part of your independence is the exclusivity you have with your own network and your own announcers and your own pre-scheduled start times. No other college football team in the country has their own TV announcers for every home game and that they can count on.
Let me throw this one at you, Matt. Is this a possibility? This may not work. This may sound crazy, and maybe Michigan or an Ohio State or Penn State would block this. Because the value of the Notre Dame NBC deal right now is it's the home games, and that's what it. But what if NBC said, we will pay you this many dollars for every Notre Dame game to the Big Ten?
Like as an independent?
Like, no, as a member of the Big Ten. So when they go to Ohio State, it's on NBC.
Oh, okay.
The NBC crew announces it.
Is that possible?
Why not?
What
there are no rules anymore, Matt.
There are no rules, but I mean, this wouldn't be the ACC we're talking about, where Notre Dame clearly it's, hey, come join us come save us during COVID. It's okay, you can go back to independent after, but we just need you now. Or, hey, we need you as a partial member because we're going to get game day now. We're going to get a network now. We're going to have all these sellouts that we otherwise wouldn't have had. I don't think the Big Ten doesn't need Notre Dame the way that.
Well, that would require Fox to also give up Notre Dame at Ohio State, Notre Dame at Michigan.
Right.
I just
think their home game rights, like there's people have to have some ownership of something, I would think.
Or when Notre Dame's on the road, you can put another Big Ten game on NBC at 3:30 Eastern time or at whatever time slot you choose. But you could also make that the package where when Notre Dame's at home, you get them NBC, and when they're on the road, you have like fourth choice.
Well, so that's why when it sounded earlier in the winter that NBC was making a play at the Big Ten, um, people at Notre Dame alleviated the initial concerns for me, I guess, that I had, which was essentially, no, we welcome that with open arms because the way we see it, we would be able to renegotiate our current deal with NBC as is because they're taking on all this other inventory. And by doing that, we would reap a lot of the benefits financially of being a Big Ten football property without actually joining the Big Ten conference.
Right, because you could get a lead in if it's a game before yours, or you could be a lead in to a game after yours, and that would help. But so I definitely think that there are a lot of creative ways to do all this stuff. It's hard for me to wrap my brain around it, Matt, because it's only been 5 days now that I've been trying to accept that Notre Dame probably needs to join a but you mentioned this earlier, and the idea of a conference. What the Big Ten and the SEC are about to become are not what conferences were when Notre Dame
NFL conferences
right embraced its independence. Exactly. Yeah, the conferences are more like what an NFL division is,
and they each get their own network too, right? The NFC is on Fox, the AFC is on CBS,
right?
ESPN,
Exactly.
and Fox in this case.
Well, and so if this were to happen, it's not so much Notre Dame turning its back on independence, it's Notre Dame choosing to continue to participate in big time college football because this is what it's going to look like.
Yeah, I mean, there's no hesitation, I think, at least internally. I mean, externally, there'll be some people there who express their concerns about the direction this sport and college sports as a whole are going. But who are we kidding? Like, Notre Dame's a football powerhouse. It's a great academic school too, and you can be both, as I think they've learned through the last 5 to 10 years and much of the Brian Kelly era. Right? Like, no one looks at. I always make this analogy because Notre Dame's facilities are in massive need of an upgrade, and there's always some push and pull behind the scenes there. Does anyone look at Northwestern as a lesser academic institution after they spent $270 million to build a lakefront facility that might be the nicest in the country? No, absolutely not.
This is the conversation Ari and I have all the time. You're allowed to have a kick-ass football team and a kick-ass children's hospital. You're allowed to have both. It's okay. And that's something that I feel like some schools in the Big Ten recognize and others don't. But that's the league with the group of schools most equipped to be both.
I mean, for everything we just said about Notre Dame, and not to take this conversation elsewhere, but that applies to Michigan more than anything else.
Absolutely. Like that's who we're usually talking about when I say it.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you mentioned Ari. I figured that's what you're getting at. Like, that's a school where they seem very content with things. And I'm not saying they don't have a lot to be proud of, but I also think they could be a lot better as a football program than they already are, which again is very, very good. But I think there's more meat on the bone there.
Yep, I think you're right. Speaking of more meat on the bone, there's a very meaty bone that is, to this point, we believe, protected by a 3.5-page piece of paper that you got to read in The Athletic over the weekend. The ACC, with its grant of rights that lasts through 2036, we think that can keep the league together, but we don't know. We know there are lawyers looking into it. But if Notre Dame were to join, say, the Big Ten, that chips a piece away of that ACC ESPN deal. That might be something that would cause them to wriggle out. You saw John Canzano today out in Portland with a really interesting story about the Pac-12 and the ACC potentially exploring a loose partnership where they kind of sell their TV rights as one. And I don't know if that means that the ACC would be able to reopen its TV deal with a totally new and try to create a totally new deal. Would it mean they the ACC network and ESPN kind of consume what was the Pac-12 network, and then they add that to their footprint. They raise the price per subscriber. The ACC gets to keep some or all of that money. I don't know what that means. I do think if they actually got to, it's an interesting poison pill situation here, Matt. If they actually got to reopen their TV deal, if they were allowed to renegotiate the TV deal, which if you'd asked somebody in that league a year ago, that's what has to happen. Just from reading the grant of rights. And again, I wrote a whole story about it explaining I don't know what the hell any of this means. And I talked to a lawyer who did. But one thing I did understand reading it is that every single bit of it is tied to that ESPN contract. So if that particular ESPN contract is ripped up, I don't think the grant of rights holds anymore either.
Yeah, I don't think so either. And again, it's it's intentionally amorphous, right? Because it's something that is going to give anyone looking to break it serious hesitation, because you could be looking at, I don't know if I go as far as say upwards of $1 billion in exit fees / negotiations, but it's hundreds of millions. It is. And I think if it could have been broken by now, it probably would have been broken, or at least they're studying it with that intention. If something were to happen as far as a merger or collaboration with the Pac-12 or whatever, I would have to think that reopens everything and puts everything into question. And I know people in that league, in the ACC, who basically that's their kind of hope and prayer right now as far as what they can control. Root for chaos, because the more chaos that happens, the less reality will resemble what they signed up for when they signed that ESPN deal for 20 years, which would then muddy the waters a little bit, I think, as far as what the grant of rights actually is and looks like and is worth and valued at.
Well, and it's interesting because we talked about Notre Dame. I think the next most valuable piece on the board is in the ACC, but it's probably not who the average listener thinks it is. The average listener is probably going Clemson, of course. Why? That's who everybody would want. They win national titles. No, it's North Carolina, because North Carolina is the one that the Big Ten and the SEC would both covet.
I mean, look, if you're talking about brand power outside of Notre Dame, that's the biggest. I know Oregon is Nike, but we're talking about the flagship school in the state of North Carolina, one of the fastest growing media markets in the country, the 10th biggest state in the country, and the biggest state that does not currently reside in either the SEC's or the Big Ten's footprint. We all know about the basketball team. We know all about women's soccer and all the other great programs they have, Olympic sport programs they have on campus there. Football program, it can hold its own. I mean, it's not bad.
Sleeping giant, Matt. Sleeping giant.
They all are in that state. We hear every year. How many schools have their own color? Carolina blue. Like, that's not a coincidence. Like,
that's the Tennessee fans raising their hands, but that's orange. This is blue. More people wear blue. Yes. Sorry, guys.
Yes. And I just think you look at the history of that program, the academic prestige, or at least what they think of themselves as academic prestige. I know a lot of people at NC State and elsewhere would punch back at that after some of the headlines over the last decade coming out of Chapel Hill, but it's an academically prestigious institution. They have a hold on that state like no one else in that state does. There's a certain former point guard with a UNC diploma who still remains very influential in the college athletic space, and who was the most powerful man in college athletics for about 30 years.
Matt said point guard, not shooting guard.
Correct.
It's not MJ, it's Jim Delaney.
Delaney, former Big Ten commissioner. And I think you mentioned this to me offline. Their previous chancellor, Carol Folt, is now the president of USC, which is a Big Ten school, last I checked. So
yeah,
there's a lot working. There are a lot of reasons, good, easy reasons we can point to explain why North Carolina would be a great fit for the Big Ten. And I think a lot of those same reasons apply to the SEC as well. Maybe a little more loosely. But the SEC would want them too.
I think the thought, just from a football perspective, is if you're taking from the ACC, you'd want Clemson and Florida State. NC State and Virginia Tech actually feel like they make a little more sense as in terms of cultural
Culturally,
fits in
yeah.
the SEC. But remember, this is the SEC that just took the University of Texas, the University of Oklahoma. They left Oklahoma State behind. I think they may be hunting flagships. And that's where University of North Carolina comes in. And if you're talking about completing the set, Matt, I'll give you a quiz. You said North Carolina is the largest state that contains neither a Big Ten nor an SEC school. Do you know what the next largest state that contains neither one of those things is?
Would it be, I don't know, Virginia?
It is. It is. So, University of Virginia also seems like a great fit for the Big Ten. I would not be shocked if it were coveted as well by the SEC.
I think it makes sense. I mean, say which, like, the Big Ten and SEC have forever had this tit for tat, right? And clearly it's culminating in them basically annexing whoever they want and being the only two conferences that really matter from a financial and probably competitive standpoint. The thing about the SEC, and I'm not saying this is intentional, I'm not saying it's going to stay this way forever, because as we've all seen, a lot of stuff changes. It's still pretty regional, and I don't mean that like, oh, it's not big enough. I mean, like,
no, I think that's a choice. Yeah, I think they feel like
the Southeast Conference.
Yeah, dominate that region. It's the one region that'll never stop. Or well, I said never is probably a bad choice, a bad word to choose. If the country stops loving football, the last place people will stop loving football is the Southeast.
Correct.
So it makes sense to consolidate there. And when I say they would covet North Carolina and UVA, I don't mean that they wouldn't take Clemson if Clemson were available to them. I think they would. I think Clemson has always been culturally an SEC school and just happened to be in the other conference. But again, a lot of hoops to jump through with that grant of rights. I don't know that anything happens unless Notre Dame makes a move first. That's where I think everything's sort of hinging on that, because, well, we can take this full circle, Matt. Again, if you're Oregon and Washington, you're waiting on a firm no from the Big Ten before you do anything. Well, I'm not sure you get a firm anything unless they know what Notre Dame's going to do.
I tend to agree with you. My question moving forward, big picture, essentially is, look, we know Notre Dame's going to make money for whoever they go to. I think when you look at the two big conferences, each having 16 teams right now, again, that's probably the only one that'll make you whole financially when you add them.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a game of war, right? Like, if I'm the SEC, I need to get North Carolina right now so that the Big Ten does it. Because eventually they're all going to come to us or them, and it's better for us to scoop them up now. Even if adding North Carolina, while despite everything I just said, that's positive, it's not going to make any individual school in that conference richer overnight.
Well, and this is my question last week. Are these guys the NFL and the AFL, or the NFC and the AFC? Because if eventually they're going to work together, it doesn't matter. But if they're looking at this like one of us is going to eat the other at some point, which I got to be honest, 150 years of history tells me that's probably what the case will be. One of them will eventually eat the other. I don't know when, how many years that would take. But so I would try to build the strongest mousetrap I could build.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you're the SEC, no question, you're the preeminent football conference in the country. It's probably going to stay that way for the foreseeable future, if not all of eternity. And I don't think all of this is happening right now had they not struck first last year by adding Texas and Oklahoma. That being said, even with Texas and Oklahoma, and even before USC and UCLA, Big Ten still was valued a little bit more by TV properties. And I don't know if you could ever make up that. I mean, look, if the Big Ten adds Notre Dame tomorrow, there's no catch up with them ever for anyone financially. But how much value do you put on that if you're the SEC? Or does it not matter because you've got smaller athletic programs and your athletic departments, and you're not worried about as many sports.
Right.
So I don't know. I think that part remains to be seen as well. But that's my biggest question, philosophically speaking, from right now on July 5th is the next move the one that's going to make, and again, taking Notre Dame out of the equation, is the next move the one that will make people the most money, or is it done to as essentially being proactive and staving off the other from maybe eventually scooping up that school?
We don't know right now, Matt, and that's the hardest part is not having solid information. You and I both know from talking to people that there's a lot going on behind the scenes. A lot of people who won't answer the phone right now who would normally answer the phone, which is a tell in and of
Yes.
itself. It's it's going to be a really interesting between now and when the first football gets kicked.
Media days, Big 12's in 8 days.
I mean, yeah, and it's going to be potentially a different landscape by then,
Yeah.
depending on how these dominoes fall. It could be a year from now. It could be 6 months from now. It could be 2 months from now. It could be this week. And that part we don't know. We would give you definitive information if we had it. That's our job.
I
But we
would go
just,
on vacation if I for once this year if I knew that like something was or wasn't going to happen.
oh,
But I
I'm so
secretly
glad
love
I
this
took it the
stuff.
week
So
before last because I ain't getting any more. So, but it is going to be a very hectic next few weeks. I mean, fortunately, we're just covering it. We're not the ones having to actually make these decisions.
oh, it's great for business.
Yeah, it's good for business for us. I wouldn't want to have to make these decisions that have very long term consequences that seem to be coming under pressure with time constraints, with money constraints, with contractual constraints. It would not be much fun, but you're going to see decisions get made and the dominoes start to fall. And there's a lot of permutations that are flying around right now because we don't know what's going to happen. And if I had to guess, I'd say we won't know until a few people in South Bend, Indiana decide what they want to do.
I think you're right, Andy. I think you're right. I don't know much in this crazy, mad college football world anymore, but I feel pretty confident in saying that Notre Dame still holds plenty of cards and will dictate the next steps from here on out.
And you can hear him talking about Notre Dame on the Shamrock. He's Matt Fortuna. Matt, thank you so much. I'm sure we will be talking about 50 more times this week.
Looking forward to it, my friend.